Some horror movies want you dead. Some, however, want to do something way worse to you before that. And that's where things get ungodly creepy, because horror has discovered some truly disturbing ways to do the human body. Mutations, fishmen, giant worms, alien goo parasites, spectral presences, demons, a genetically engineered baby that becomes the monster. These aren't just throwaway moments of gore. Some are legendary moments of exploitation, some controversial, and some even disturbing backstories to their creation. Plus, there's Alien, which doesn't technically show an assault, but its whole reproductive and creature concept is straight up born from the same nightmare. From classic exploitation to some of horror's grandest moments, here are 12 times the monster proved killing you was the easy part.
Rosemary's Baby, 1968. Now, I have to assume that there's one film on this list in particular that could say it truly created this trope, and that film is 1968's Rosemary's Baby. Now, as disturbing as any aspect of the movie is regarding Rosemary, the part that's the most horrific is who let it happen. In Rosemary's Baby, there's Rosemary, a woman who's been set up to feel secure in the one she holds most dear. A supposedly loving husband who she's supposed to blindly trust in everything, and even neighborly type figures who she feels are looking out for her and doing the things a friend should. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Rosemary is drugged with the assistance of her very own husband, rendering her unable to move, while her neighbors who have been there for her so faithfully all along perform their ritual as Satan impregnates her. And you have to admit, the film is effective with the way in which it introduces this aspect of reality to Rosemary. The dreamlike state she's initially left in all but convinces the viewer that these things may be imagined, and then gradually leaves them no doubt that, unfortunately, this nightmare has indeed come true, thanks to the complicity of the people she perceived as her closest allies. I have to admit, though, what lingers the longest for me after I viewed the film is Guy's nonchalant excuse following what Rosemary endured, that he didn't want to miss baby night. My God, man, what's wrong with you? I found that kind of domestic betrayal to be one of the defining factors in why this movie was a horror sensation. It wasn't simply an outside force attacking Rosemary in a way she couldn't comprehend her defeat. Rosemary had essentially and unknowingly been delivered to the wolves by her husband. And all that, I must say, for a film released in mainstream Hollywood in 1968, felt truly daring for such a large audience, as it would prove instrumental for countless horror endeavors. Alien, 1979. So, before I go ahead with the description of this one, I feel I must stress something very important. The film Alien doesn't feature an explicit scene of a literal assault, as quite a few of the other films that are on this list do. This one is here purely because of the image and symbolism that are being carried are doing the work. The facehugger comes to attack Kane, who happens to be a male member of the crew, as O'Bannon deliberately wanted to make male viewers feel sexually violated, and forces itself onto him, planting an embryo. O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, intended this to reverse the vulnerability traditionally imposed on female characters. In other words, they decided to have their male viewers share the terror of having their own bodies rendered out of their control, and then made them aware of the threat. The H.R. Geiger design is, well, it isn't subtle, as there is an image symbolism in every element. The facehugger, the alien itself, the particularity of the entire reproductive sequence are all sexually symbolic, and critics, for decades, have analyzed the sexual symbolism in Geiger's designs and the film. And Barbara Creed's notion of the monstrous feminine is essential. Then we have the chest burster. The alien burrows out of Kane's body in an actual, in effect, horrific and violent birthing, as it demonstrates what makes the film of a vital importance in its relation to the trope, transforming a procreative sequence into something frightening. So in conclusion, no, it's not a real scene of rape or assault. It's the subtext that makes it unsettling. Humanoids from the Deep, 1980. Humanoids from the Deep is one of those movies where the real story of what actually happened behind the scenes will be more interesting than what happened to the critters that crawled out of the ocean and found their way into a small coastal town. Essentially, this is about as Roger Corman B movie as they come. And while a bit crude, it also has so much potential to be genuinely not terrifying so much as deeply disturbing, with its basic plotline of mutant fishmen trying to reproduce with human women after some questionable genetic experiments go overboard, with a pretty wild backstory to boot. But for all the absurdity, Humanoids from the Deep is largely made fascinating by what was going on behind the camera. As you may suspect, the film's director, Barbara Peters, found her production taking further and further into the exploitation without her say. In fact, she even refused to photograph the film's more offensive scenes after disagreements over how violent things were getting. Instead, what Corman did was hire a completely separate film crew to film only those scenes Peters wouldn't shoot, creating an internal conflict where her directorial will is set against her producer's desire to really shove this movie into excruciating, exploitative hell. Ultimately, it's this fascinating behind-the-camera argument that makes Humanoids from the Deep not necessarily an actual horror classic, although it did spark protests and controversy at the time, far more memorable than anything swimming in its murky, watery depths. The Evil Dead, 1981. Alright, this is where things get extremely awkward as this list moves into the Evil Dead, as the scene we're referring to is the one that Sam Raimi has spent years regretting. In the film, the character of Cheryl is seen wandering through the woods alone when she's set upon by the demonically possessed trees and vine. While the scene was clearly intended to be startling and unsettling, Raimi has since admitted that he felt the sequence was gratuitous and unneeded. It was to the point that he left that explicit sexual element out of his next film, Evil Dead 2, which is admittedly kind of remarkable since this was Raimi's first commercially released feature film, and he clearly threw everything at the wall with how far he would push his audience. But later on, after having some perspective, he decided maybe they didn't need to do that to her. This scene also caused a lot of trouble for the film international. The Evil Dead was banned in several countries due to the violence that was present, this particular scene being a major point of criticism, and many other countries heavily censored the film. So this particular sequence may have been responsible for quite a bit of the film's cult classic shock value. Amazingly, all of this circles right back around to the 2013 remake, where despite Raimi actively removing the explicit element years prior, that same scene concept was recycled, in no small part due to a producer who demanded it to be included. It just makes the whole thing more about the conflict between filmmakers and producers. Even actress Ellen Sandweiss stated that the initial script only described that Cheryl is attacked by the woods, without any mention of what could end up being in the final cut of the scene. Honestly, this entire context surrounding the scene is far more interesting than the scene itself, but for all the reasons previously stated, we still get one of the most notorious scenes in horror history. Galaxy of Terror, 1981. Okay, so Galaxy of Terror is one of those films where the making of is almost harder to watch than the film itself. It's basically a typical Corman space horror flick. A space crew is stranded on an alien world with a machine that physically creates the fears they hold most dear in their hearts. Not to mention a giant 12-foot mutated maggot dumped on top to finish off the recipe for a cosmological disaster. Damia, one of the crew, is apparently afraid of worms, which is conveniently where the alien device decides to make her fears come true. But it's actually how the scene got made that's the most important here. The scene was originally supposed to be a standard death. Then the producer, Roger Corman, rewrote it after promising the film's financiers a sex scene. So, a plain monster death morphed into a sleazier transaction. And actress Hafe O'Connell said that the scene made her feel uncomfortable due to the extremely cold temperatures, and she had balked at the more explicit rewritten scene before ultimately agreeing to it, which means it's tough to separate the scene from its production detail. And there's another great homage to Alien, since the film's production design is clearly influenced by H.R. Geiger, the guy who designed the aforementioned xenomorph. And for those wondering who might have been manning the camera, a young James Cameron handled production design and second unit direction and contributed to the effects work. So in the end, while Galaxy of Terror appears at the face value to be the ultimate expression of space horror schlock, and arguably it could be, in reality, it's merely a basic, marketable story stretched a bit longer. The Entity, 1982. Alright, this is maybe the entry that belongs the most on this list, as The Entity essentially strip mines almost every inch of distance from the viewer and on-screen action. There's no campy monster, no crazy B-movie concept driving the action, and nothing to justify dismissing it as just another horror film. What The Entity does is show us a single mother, Carla Morin, played by Barbara Hershey, being terrorized by unseen forces within her own home. With each repeated attack, the forces become even more aggressive, while the onlookers surrounding Carla, and in particular the doctors attempting to diagnose her, first dismiss the problem as hysteria. The thing that makes The Entity so different from other films on this list is the fact that the story was inspired by a real case. The character of Carla Moran was modeled after a woman, Doris Bither, who in 1974 told researchers associated with UCLA that an invisible entity was attacking her in her own home. Whether you believe Bither's story or not, the fact that the story behind the film was rooted in a real-world case lends this film a whole new gravity. I think what makes the dynamic between doctors and Carla so interesting is that Carla is telling them something horrific is happening to her, while the medical community is attempting to argue that there must be something wrong with her. It's really an interesting dynamic because the film itself doesn't dismiss Carla's account one bit. The contrast between them and the tension it built led to the film having significant cultural impact. The movie sparked controversy, protests by women's groups, and criticism. Because of this, I think this film absolutely deserves to be here. The horror doesn't come from the entity as much as it comes from the feeling of being ignored when you say something's happening to you. Poltergeist, 1982. Poltergeist is a strange one as far as horror films are concerned because the majority of the film plays more like an accessible horror classic, with a family in a house being targeted by a paranormal activity culminating in the beast attempting to take the daughter, Carol Ann. It feels very harsh compared to the rest of Poltergeist. This is one of the cases where I watched the scene and thought to myself, is this part of the same film as in Haunted TV, a little girl talking to ghosts? But perhaps the strangest thing about all of this is that the scene was originally conceived as more explicit. The visual effects team developed a more overt violation of Diane using a special harness, but the idea was scrapped because it threatened the film's desired PG rating. Separately, Poltergeist was initially rated R by the MPAA before being changed to PG on appeal. This alone demonstrates to quite a large degree the kind of film Poltergeist could have been. In the actual film, the scene relies much more on implication rather than the full picture being revealed. A correct decision, perhaps, given that the film was targeting a PG rating. Furthermore, coming out the same year as The Entity, the comparison between the two films is quite easy to draw up. Both films focus on attacking their female protagonists. However, in Poltergeist, the disturbing scene is merely packaged inside the conventional family horror film. The Beast Within, 1982. Now, The Beast Within twists this somewhat by making the actual attack in question 17 years before the rest of the movie even happened. It's somehow connected to why pretty much everything else in the movie comes to pass as well. The film begins back in 1964 when a brand new bride, Caroline McCleary, comes under attack in the woods by something completely unseen while her husband goes out to find assistance for a malfunctioning vehicle. While the film doles out bits and pieces along the way, we soon find out why this event is incredibly significant. About 17 years after that night, Caroline's son, Michael, begins an abhorrent and horrifying transformation, one that can be traced directly to his mother's ordeal all those years ago and the monstrous nature of his true father. So, beneath all the creature material, the movie is essentially a story about the aftermath of an event that happened in the distant past. Michael doesn't just become a monster. His transformation is the result of a ghastly family secret nobody wishes to acknowledge. Speaking of a family secret, the film is also tinged with a small-town conspiracy of sorts. When the family comes back to the region where Caroline encountered that unidentified attacker decades ago, the townsfolk are not at all accommodating, offering very little cooperation in the family's search for answers, implying that certain things about the past were perhaps meant to be conveniently ignored and thus concealing certain things from the family. Ultimately, the film becomes an old-school creature transformation film, complete with spectacular practical monster effects, a fantastic performance, and an entertaining cast. But where The Beast Within truly differentiates itself in the pantheon of such pictures is when the monster ultimately reveals himself, since you may be surprised to discover that this beast doesn't really unleash the terror when he comes out into the open. The terror actually stems from an attack 17 years prior, which has continued to be hidden for quite a while and is simply beginning to emerge. From Beyond, 1986. Some of the scariest films out there rely on the idea of showing you something you were never meant to be able to see. That's where From Beyond comes in, and it even ups that question. What if it were possible to really see it? The film focuses on the resonator machine that excites the human pineal gland and gives its users the ability to see demonic entities that lie in another dimension. It sounds like fun in theory, but there's one slight hitch. As soon as you're able to see them, they can see you too. When Dr. Pretorius becomes a rather lewd and grotesque creature after being drawn into the dimension opened by the device, things take a turn for the deeply upsetting. After he somehow makes a return, Pretorius then torments Dr. Catherine McMichaels by showing his monstrous forms and sexually aggressive behavior, dragging the movie somewhere beyond uncomfortable. However, whereas the other entries on this list are more straightforward in there's something that was never meant to exist horror, From Beyond's not afraid to delve into its 80s gore, psychosexual body horror elements, and its desire to play with and to mess with your own body. This isn't some simple story-based attack though. I find that it's centered more on your feelings of sexual hunger as your own body betrays you and instead belongs to something other than you, a Lovecraftian nightmare of a lost weekend. Its practical effects will wow you, with its creature and body effects absolutely grotesque, and every bit as over-the-top and bizarre as a Lovecraftian adaptation in the 80s really should be. So, while this wasn't a traditional there's a monster story, what else could even really qualify this with the intent behind the movie in question? Besides, what happens when your body doesn't belong to you anymore? Communion, 1989. Now this one is particularly bizarre, the main reason being that it isn't female-centered, unlike much of what we covered here. The actual victim in this is a man, as we previously mentioned. This isn't just fiction though. The topic of communion is horror author Whitley Strieber. This one centers on Christopher Walken as Strieber, who all of a sudden starts having blackouts, nightmares, and a jumbled series of memories. Under hypnosis, the film shows him regressing and rediscovering memories of abduction by otherworldly beings, and being physically examined and experimented on. This, according to Stryber, included instances of sexual violation. The peculiarity, however, with Communion is that it has no concrete conclusion regarding what was actually witnessed or what happened. Was Stryber actually abducted by an extraterrestrial species? Was he subject to mental abuse or suffering a psychological breakdown? Were these visions real, imaginary, or a mix of the two? The film deliberately doesn't present itself with a definitive answer, and in a way, that's its real strength. Added to that, we have to take into consideration how extremely unusual the connection with our physical world becomes. Stryber's original book, on which the film is based, was presented by him as truth and nonfiction, and he's held that stance for decades now. This again makes the movie feel unique on this list. Whereas previously we focused on women who were subjects of a similar horror, we now focus on an adult male in the role of the victim. We have to accept, for the sake of argument, the idea that Whitley Strieber himself is not just writing this story, and that while he may or may not be accurate, the sustained nature of his position over 3 decades elevates Communion beyond a simple alien horror movie into a full-blown existential problem of memory, mental trauma, and the erosion of subjective confidence. Hawa, 2003. All right, let's step away from Hollywood for a little while now and venture into India for Hawa, a Hindi horror film with none other than Taboo. Right, as much as I try to find a Bollywood original, it looks as though Hawa has adapted the same concept as The Entity and tailored it to an Indian setting. The film follows a divorced single mother by the name of Sanjana, who moves to a secluded home with her kids and younger brother. Naturally, moving into a seemingly creepy, isolated house is never a great plan, especially when you're watching a horror movie. And so, strange and unsettling things begin to happen to Sanjana very quickly, and an unseen force seems to connect to the property and has been attacking her with increasing regularity. If that sounds familiar, that's because it is, as many reviewers and viewers alike did indeed pick up on the similarity. Rather than get into a huge discussion on plagiarism, I think that a more productive perspective of Hawa is to treat it as an unofficial remake or homage to The Entity, with a strong Indian influence on the storytelling, cinematic, and cultural style. What really made Hawa stand out, however, was just how weird and taboo it was for the mainstream Hindi movies at the time. Contemporary reviewers noted that its treatment of sexual violence pushed it to a relatively new territory for Hindi cinema. To make things even more surprising, it starred India's finest actress, Taboo, and her ability to handle the role of a violated woman is breathtaking. Therefore, rather than the shock value that Hawa had to offer, the most impressive thing that can be noted from this film is the way that it dared to bring a notion that was largely viewed as taboo into mainstream Bollywood cinema and prove that the trope of a ghostly assault is most definitely not solely a Hollywood phenomenon. Splice, 2009. Somehow we've come all the way to the film that closes out this list, and it probably closes out in the bleakest fashion possible. After all, at first glance, the monster is fairly clear in Splice. You have Dren, a genetically engineered human-animal hybrid manufactured by scientists Clive and Elsa. However, the more you think about what happens to Dren, the more difficult it is to ascertain who the real monster is. Dren is born in a laboratory and raised by Clive and Elsa, with no consideration of her as anything more than a test subject that needs to be managed. As she grows, she undergoes a disturbing transformation in appearance, as well as changing from female to male. This is the basis of the film's climactic finale, where Dren brutally rapes Elsa, after which Clive impales him and Elsa ultimately kills him. Truthfully, however, the attack on Elsa is hardly the spotlight of Splice, but the event that follows is more likely to be memorable. Elsa is revealed to be pregnant, apparently by Dren, and accepts a large payment from her employer to carry the pregnancy to term and take the experiment to the next stage despite its deeply immoral conception. Such a degenerate final turn in a horror film only makes the journey of the storyline itself even bleaker. However, throughout the film, Clive and Elsa use and take the form of Dren at every possible point in her life. They produced, experimented with, controlled, and treated her like a scientific experiment and not a living being, which means the question isn't how can you make Dren into a monster, it's how the humans could have created one. And in the off chance that you take one thing from this list, it's that occasionally the scariest creature in the room isn't the creature at all. But honestly, looking at all these movies, I think there's one simple reason for the prevalence of this trope. It's scary not to be in control of your own body, more so than death at times. We've covered real-life inspired ghost stories, cheap B-movie monster movies, horror classics, and new creature features alike. Yet many of these instances are even more unsettling due to the fact that the filmmakers of said movies have not always been pleased with what resulted from it. Sam Raimi regretted what he originally filmed in The Evil Dead. Tafe O'Connell described the Galaxy of Terror scene as physically challenging, and Barbara Peters objected to what was added to Humanoids from the Deep. And I think maybe this is why they stick in our mind. A jump scare will vanish from thought the second the credits roll. An event like this doesn't. What scene was most disturbing to you? What movie did we end up leaving out? Leave your comments down below. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any more of our marvelous videos. Stay safe, have a great day, and as always, stay marvelous.